Well, I'm pleased to be here, and thanks for the wonderful introduction. You took a lot of my time, but you I talk, so it evens. It's all evened out. And one of the reasons that I'm really pleased to be here is, and I've said this on occasion when asked by reporters, what's a good school of education? And Peabody for me is the world leader in doing the sorts of things that we're interested in funding at IES. Indeed, a national resource, and that we can accomplish in terms of the money we send out the door. We can take that money and do good things with it. So you got two of our centers and our pre-doc training program, a bunch of grants, and so if the enterprise fails, it's all your fault because you have to do the work that matters. I think the title of my talk, as it was given to you, is Empirical Education, Past and Future. And Dave did talk a lot about the past and go over it very lightly because he did touch on some major points. And start with that drives it all. And the simple concept is that systematic empiricism, if it's applied to education, will produce the sorts of improvements and changes that have been seen in other fields that have turned from folk wisdom and professional consent, like systematically collecting and using the data to make decisions. And systematic empiricism, in my thinking about it, two categories which blend together somewhere in the middle. One is scientific research, the sort of stuff that's done at this institution and institutions like this. And the other is the collection and use of data on the ground by teachers and principals and superintendents to track what they're doing and try to make corrections as they go forward, and to determine if selections are made based on scientific research and mechanisms like the What Works Clearinghouse are in fact working on the ground. So both those mechanisms together seem to me the kind of mechanisms that other fields have used to generate progress, and I think they will work in education as well. The story of the past is a story that Dave touched on. It's a story of people seeming to understand that education was not well grounded in evidence, and various reports from distinguished panels about the need for it to do so, and an occasional interrupted start at the federal level to do something. There was a blossoming in the late and early 70s of serious investment in education research and attempts to evaluate project follow-through, for example, was a national plan variation study and a commitment to serious evaluation. And then that faded away. And so my analysis of the state of things when I came on board at the U.S. Department of Education aligned pretty well with the Academy's view of things, and that is that education was really unlike other fields in the degree that it did not rely on evidence and instead relied on the other sources of action, sort of slow learning from experience and professional consensus and advocacy and all the things that are still present and are driving education. So, and as I tried to categorize the research, it seemed to me it fell in a nice 2x2 table, and with different population sizes in the cells of the table. One table, the table most with the most entries from the point of view of policymakers, is the table of there are two dimensions here. There's relevance and strength of the quality of the research. And so one of the cells is high relevance, low quality, and a lot of that work. And that's the sort of work I found most people turning to. Something that looks like a meta-analysis that's been run off by somebody, but you look at it and it was garbage in, so it had to be garbage out. Selective reviews of research where you can tell in the first couple of paragraphs what the conclusion is going to be, and then it's just a process of people marshaling evidence that supports the conclusion that they have drawn before they started looking at evidence. Descriptions of a best practice that have the loosest sort of empirical base, not even grounded in the empirical identification of high-performing units. Somebody has said this is an award-winning school, and now we're going to tell you what the critical ingredients of this school are that you ought to be able to replicate elsewhere. Now, so there's relevant and weak. There's a fairly large population of entries in the strong but irrelevant. People at universities who know how to design good research in terms of methodological and statistical quality, but looking at problems that are so far removed from the problems that are addressed by practitioners and policymakers that they have correctly criticized university-based research for lack of relevance to their enterprise. And then, a fair amount of both weak and irrelevant research, some of that in the academy as well. So that's the kind of state of affairs. And since, as Dave says, there have been numerous reports that have recognized, talked about that, just being able to look at it and say, well, there's a problem here, is only a first step, and a first step that's relatively easy to take. So the question is what to do about it. And here I think that I and the very strong group of senior people at IES who are working with me have had the advantage of kind of a unique window in time and opportunity. It was really a combination of No Child Left Behind and the enthusiasm for education reform at the federal level, combined with OERI needing to be reauthorized, and just really thinking about it, happenstance, personnel selections coming together that allowed something to happen that have happened under another set of circumstances. So we've had an opportunity to do some things, and the reauthorization of the office opened up possibilities for doing things differently. And we've been I had a criticism from a significant staffer in Congress just this past week about, they just can't figure out what we're doing. Everything we send up there has a lot of asterisks associated with it and not a lot of information filled in. And in part, that has been planful. We have tried to retain enough influence over the actions that we take in order, because we're ultimately going to be held responsible for those actions, to actually have room to negotiate and move and get things done. What have we done? Again, very briefly, there have been very significant changes in staffing at the research office of the U.S. Department of Education. I know you've had some of the commissioners here I think maybe all of the commissioners have been here at one time or another to give talks. They're outstanding people, and the people under them are outstanding people, well-trained, could have faculty positions at almost any university in America, and that makes a big difference. To be able to manage something well, I think you have to know what you're trying to manage, and having people there who know the business and can take positions and defend those positions thoughtfully is extremely important. We've established a set of priorities. You may not agree with them, but they're relatively clear. We're interested in academic achievement. We're interested in kids who are historically at risk. We're interested in the variables that are largely under the control of the school systems. That is not to say by any means that those are the only important things in the education outcome for students and kids, but it is to say they are the things we're interested in and that we think we can have the most leverage over. We have, as Dave said, tried to be as clear as we can be about the kind of research we're interested in supporting. And so in the first couple of years, I and Lynn Okagaki spent entire weekends trying to write those RFAs, make them clear enough so that we thought people could understand what we were looking for. And Lynn continues to spend weekends doing that. I'm just a figurehead these days in that area. But it's important, I think, for to be clear, to make it, first to be clear with yourself about what you're trying to do, and then be clear with others. I can't, and so it's very hard to get attention anywhere outside the research community on the next point I'm going to make. But I think it's an absolutely critical piece, and that's the peer review and funding mechanism piece. I've heard grumblings from some of you as I talked to you yesterday, because there are a lot of faculty in the office who've spent the last few days reading a lot of proposals to IES for the upcoming competition, because those faculty members serve on peer review panels, and they're doing their homework before they show up to participate in the panels that rate the proposals. But building an enterprise in which you can attract people into careers in education research depends on the establishment of mechanisms that are seen as and just. At least they provide rough justice, so that if you develop competence and you work hard, there's a good chance that you're going to be able to get funded for work that you propose to do. And otherwise, to go into a career that doesn't have that sort of mechanism associated with it is to be pathological. And God bless the few of you who have been pathological enough to persevere in careers where the possibilities of funding are uncertain and cliquish and all the rest. But having a solid peer review is extremely important, and then not meddling with it is the other part of that. So while it's on my authority, my signature, that every grant in the Institute is made, it takes a very unusual set of circumstances for me to alter in any way at all the rank ordering that comes up from the peer reviewers. And an authority I used to actually need to exercise about where to draw the cut line, I've taken away from myself as well by saying that we have a 5-point summary scale for grants, and we say that with rare exceptions that we're going to draw the cut line at a score of 2 on the 5-point scale. So basically the peer reviewers are deciding, accounting for 99% of the variance in our funding decisions. So there's a game out there that you can play in, and I think the rules are reasonably clear, and the umpires who are responsible for those rules are qualified. So it's rational to feel you can build a career in education research, and I think that's very important. And so we've seen an explosion of activity at the application level. We've gone from 200 applications in 2002 to 900 applications in 2006, and the number will be higher this year. We've gone from 3 competitions to 20 competitions, and so I think that's evidence for the premise I'm putting before you. And the money really hasn't gone up that much. We got a little bump in research funding in the first year. I think it was from 118 million to 135 million. It's been stuck at 135 million since. And so you're not seeing the explosion in applications because there's just more money on the table. You're seeing, I think, the explosion of applications because the people are willing to play in that game now, including lots of people who never before would have applied for a research grant in education. I think roughly half of our applicants are new to the education research enterprise as funded by the U.S. Department of Education. One of the problems that we've seen that I think we are addressing is the capacity issue. As the applications have increased and the competitions have increased, we have to do more in terms of staffing our panels. So we've got about 300 people involved in peer review. And I'm sure there's some good folks out there that we've missed, but we're close to the ceiling of the people in the nation who have sufficient expertise to come in and staff our peer review panels. And there are other symptoms of lack of capacity in the field. So the pre-doc and the postdoc training programs, I think, are extremely important. It's the investment that we've made that I have never had the willies about. I'm confident every day that it was a good investment, and that confidence is pumped up as I travel around and have an opportunity to talk with people who are funded by those programs. Currently, we've got 155 pre-docs that are funded and 24 postdocs. There will be the usual and expected leakage between that number of people and those who actually take up a research career and get funded. But if half of you end up taking up jobs where you can practice what you've been trained to do, that will be a tremendous burst of capacity into the field. And we intend to continue and expand this program in the future. So it's not a one-shot deal. It should be a continuing deal. I'm excited that the topic that Dave mentioned in the regional educational labs. They've been there forever. There are 10 of them. They're required by statute. They're variations in quality and activity across the labs, but they were no matter how you characterize the quality of their work, they were, I think, appropriately described as jokers in the deck, funded by the federal government, but without really any exercise of influence or control by the federal government. So the money went out the door, and the labs, many of them characterized the money as an infrastructure investment. So it was unreasonable for us to even hold them accountable for producing anything with the money. It was like investing in in a federal highway system. You do it because you need it, not because you expect a product. So the recompetition of the labs, I think, has been very important. And if you go to the lab website, interestingly, part of the task of trying to incorporate what the labs are doing into a coherent model of what the federal government should be doing in research. Their lab site is now housed at the U.S. Department of Education. And if you go there, you can click on the projects that are out there and have been planned. There are 90 of them, and they're impressive. They're relevant topics, and they're collecting evidence and doing research on things that will be quite important. So that's, in a way, where we are. The question is, where are we going? And that's the hardest, most interesting thing to talk about, the hardest thing to control. Wayne Gretzky said you got to skate to where the puck is going to be, not where it is. And so that takes both skill and some luck. And the conversations we've been having within the Institute, we're trying to think about a model of the future and what the IS role will be in that future for education research. And just for perhaps because we like to categorize things or like to see if we can figure out a different way of thinking about this, we're talking about, we've drawn an analogy from evolutionary theory, and we're talking about the punctuated evolution model versus the continuous evolution model. Punctuated evolution, being the kind of change you get when a meteor hits the Earth, and all of a sudden you get things are extinguished en masse, and you start over with new speciation. And continuous evolution being the gradual things that, in the evolution over the course of 300 years you might not notice at all, but over the course of 10,000 years you see a dramatic change. So what's it going to look like in education? If you buy the premise that the education research enterprise is going to remain healthy and will produce results, and 25 years from now, the nature of education delivery systems will be very different from what you see now, and the efficiency of the system will be substantially improved, and the productivity of the system will be changed a lot. If we were 25 years in the future, and we could look back over the history between now and then, would there be a step function in there somewhere? Or where in a particular year, if you look back a couple of years, you would recognize that something dramatic has changed? Or is it going to be this gradual glide path? And of course, nobody knows. But the question would be, if you wanted to facilitate a kind of punctuated process, a step function, where are the opportunities? In particular, where are the opportunities where a federal investment might make possible such a dramatic change? And that's something I would engage you in thinking about and giving me suggestions on. It's not really easy to think about where investments would produce those sorts of dramatic changes. Let me give you a list that we've talked about at the Institute with various degrees of enthusiasm for particular items on the list. One that I've pushed to the top of the list based on blind faith is digital learning and computer-assisted instruction, which has a relatively dismal history in education. I mean, you can find articles in the popular press going back 25 years about how a particular technology is going to transform education. I found a very enthusiastic one about the overhead projector and how this was going. And so people have been talking about computer-assisted instruction. In fact, there's a fair amount of it that's been produced, and we've got a major national evaluation of educational technology, the results from which will be out shortly. And of course, I can't tell you what's in it without gassing everybody in the room. But I think we've got a ways to go, let's say that, in demonstrating dramatic gains from educational technology. On the other hand, you've got Moore's law and the explosion of capacity of machines and the nascent ability to do voice recognition, engage in gaming and various virtual realities. And I don't think much of that has been tapped for education. It's very expensive to do. I've talked to people who are in the software business. They're telling me they're using the same sequencer and learning engines that Patrick Suppies created 30 years ago. So it might be, without belaboring the point, that a very significant investment in the application of some of the things we know about learning to instructional technologies, whether it's for students or teachers, would make a difference. Florida already has a virtual high school, for example, where you can get a high school degree online. Competition and markets seem to me to have the potential to change things. Could be change things for the worse. It might be we look 25 years from now, we're looking back back in the day when the system actually functioned before we had all this competition and choice. It could go that direction. But I think competition and choice has the capacity to transform the system, and I've been thinking about it a lot lately in the context of Secretary's Commission on Higher Education and its report. And one of the striking things that I have noticed in that work and my thinking about it is how the higher education system, personified by Vanderbilt, and characterized by seeming vast choice. There's 6,400 post-secondary institutions in America, and nobody's forcing anybody to go to any one of those at all. And then if you go to one, you get to choose. That looks like choice. But it's a choice system that is uninformed by good information. And if I've got a son who wants to apply to go to school at Vanderbilt, I don't know what it's really going to cost. I know what the sticker price is. I don't know what it's going to cost. That's a negotiation. And I can't enter into that negotiation knowing what it would cost for my son to go to Emory. And I don't know what the value added is of going here either. I don't, maybe, University of Tennessee would be a better choice in terms of what my son might actually learn. I don't know that for particular majors. So the idea would be that a choice system that's informed, where consumers really have good information about it, productivity, the true cost, the long-term outcomes, is one that would produce dramatic change in higher education, and it might in K through 12 as well. Teacher quality is another issue where I think there are possibilities for dramatic change. We have a system now where the evidence that I'm looking at, which isn't great but is better than we used to have, suggests that different routes into teaching have extremely small impacts on student outcomes, whether it's traditional teacher education or alternative certification of type A, B, C, or D. In New York City, for example, the amount of variance accounted for by the different route into teaching is so small that the investment we've got in teacher preparation through these routes seems to me to be an event that has to be questioned. So rethinking the way that teachers are trained, teachers are selected, teachers are retained and tenured, teachers are placed, and teachers are remunerated for paid for the work that they do would be I think an area where dramatic change might occur. And of course there's in two of the areas I've mentioned, the market area and the compensation issue, you've got R&D centers here at Vanderbilt that we're funding that are going to advance work in those areas. Engineering what we know into curriculum seems to me another area of promise. We've invested in a program called Cognition and Student Learning at the Institute, and what we're doing are taking the people who would sit over in the psychology department at places like Vanderbilt and saying, well, so you've learned something about memory with undergraduates. How's that relevant to learning something in the schools? And very interesting findings with regard to memory, for example. One of the very nice findings is about the effects of testing students on recall in the context of regular textbook presentations in K through 12, where it turns out that testing kids on their recall and understanding the material has a far greater cost-benefit analysis than just asking them to study the material again, and the good kind of parametric models of when that testing ought to occur in order to maximize the retention interval. And yet you look at the construction of textbooks, and they're constructed in a way that runs counter to things we've known in memory and cognition for 25 years. So how about taking some stuff that we know and engineering it into the textbook materials themselves might be a way to go. And then utilization is the other, which is connected with the previous point. Utilization is another topic we've seen as one that might produce breakthroughs. The gap between what we know in a variety of areas and practice in the schools is huge. And what can we do to encourage that sort of translation and uptake on a much faster and more generalized scale than we do now? And one of the areas in education where the research base is richest is on drug abuse and behavior problems in the schools. And the U.S. Department of Education, through its Safe and Drug-Free School program, prioritized the selection of research-proven models a number of years ago. And so the percentage use of those models as specified in grant applications has gone from like 10% to 60%. So you look at that and it has a semblance of a dramatic shift from practice as usual and folk wisdom to evidence-based practice. But then you look at what's going on actually in the classrooms, and there's hardly any relationship between the enacted practice and the labeled practice. And we don't even have tools in most cases to look at implementation issues. So some way to connected with a professional development and accountability enterprise to get good uptake and high fidelity implementation of stuff that we know works, done at scale and over a number of areas, not piecemeal, might produce dramatic changes. So that's the punctuated evolution model and some thoughts about where big investments might make a difference. I think it's more likely that the future is going to be a continuous evolution model, and that's going to require that we all continue to do our jobs well, that we've got good delay of gratification, because we will seldom, either collectively as a community or individually, see the home runs over the fence that we get all excited about. But if we stick to it and pay attention to doing our work well, we'll see those sorts of changes. What are the threats to the continuous model? There are connected problems here, and I'm going to give you three, and they all fit together, and they're the bane of my existence. Impatience, lack of understanding of what it means to have an empirical warrant for doing something, and legislative overreaching. And what do I mean by impatience? I mean people who and this is a good thing, I suppose, at a broad philosophical level have bought into the idea that research ought to be useful, and they're facing problems. It's making AYP under No Child Left Behind or whatever. And they say, just tell me what to do and I'll do it. And they're very sincere. Just tell me what to do and I'll do it. And they expect us to be able to tell them what to do. And they're very frustrated when we're not able to do that. And because they don't understand, the empirical underpinnings, the process, the way you arrive at knowledge with a sufficient degree of certitude to be able to pass it on to others, because they don't understand that process, they're extremely frustrated by our unwillingness to tell them what to do. By our, I mean IES as well as the research community. They want guidance. So that's a problem. And the flip side of it is that when we've told them something, either we are ineffective in specifying the degree of uncertainty connected with that advice, or they don't listen to that statement of uncertainty. And so you get a rush to legislative requirements to do A rather than B. And I think, except under the rarest circumstances, and those circumstances occur but rarely occur in education, it's not a good thing for the Congress of the United States to specify Program A versus Program B, because the evidence isn't strong enough to do that, so they may be wrong, and therefore it's a mistake. And the final thing on the list, and this is my plea to you, is a continuing and problematic political passivity by the education research community, at least the part of it that I'd like to be the opposite of inactive and passive. People who are making the decisions about the education research enterprise hear constantly from almost everybody except the sorts of people in this audience. And that's a problem. And it's the nature of the beast. I spent almost my whole life being an academic, so I know it's not in the nature of the personalities of most academics to be organizing and going up to the hill to say this, that, or the other. But the absence of that is a problem in terms of carrying the work forward. All that said, I'm extremely optimistic. I think we passed the tipping point. And again, if we all stick to our knitting and do our work well and speak when we need to speak on what's important, we're going to have substantially changed future for students and the education system in America. And there'll be a history written 25 years from now about how it started with people like the people in this room doing the work that you're doing now, and how the nature of lives have changed for the better as a result of that. So thank you for everything that you do, and thank you for having me back. I think this is my third time in a year and a half, so third time is a charm, at least from my perspective. Thank you. Sure. So questions, comments, anything you'd like? Almost anything I'm open to.
Next question. Well, I'll ask a question.
Thanks.
It's been on my mind, knowing you were coming to see us
Great.
Again. It looks historically like there's a shift of funding at the federal level for research and education out of the National Science Foundation and into the Department of Education. So that's a conjecture. Then with the recent, Government Accounting Office reports on the reading first, I don't actually understand that. You describe that much more accurately than I.
Uh-huh.
So this is a really frightened investment in doing educational research through the Department of Education. And just
Well, sure.
the relation between IES scientific reviewing practices, which sound very strong, and the department's practices overall in that regard. So most of the money seems to be headed towards DOE rather than staying in the National Science Foundation.
Well, that's really not correct, or it's only partially correct. What has happened, and I think you're responding to, is that money for the math-science partnership, which was previously totally housed in the Education and Human Resource Division of the National Science Foundation, and which was roughly $200 million annual investment, has both grown significantly in federal funding, and most of the growth in funding has been money directed to the U.S. Department of Education to run its component of the math-science partnership. Otherwise, there's been certainly our budget has not gotten bigger. I told you that the research portion of our budget, both the special ed and regular ed, has been basically flat since 2003. So it's not a shift of research money. It's a shift in the particular category of funding that I've just described. One of my reflections on, for those of you not in the know, the Inspector General in the U.S. Department of Education issued a report, I think it was 3 weeks ago now, that was quite critical of the department's administration of the Reading First program, Reading First being a significant portion of No Child Left Behind that directs schools, states that apply for money under the Reading program to make awards to schools that will carry out practices consistent with those indicated to be effective in the National Reading Panel report. So there's a criticism of the stewardship of that program, and part of it had to do with the process for peer reviewing state applications. And one of my reflections on that, and I've expressed it in the department, don't mind saying so outside the department, is that the department might need to think about setting up, as we have in IES, a department responsible, a section, a component responsible for peer review that has some degree of separation from the political officers of the department and the program officers that are responsible for implementing a program. And peer review in the department, the non-IES components of the department, is very frequently a kind of one-off procedure. Congress will pass a law and that you require some kind of peer review, and so you get together some people to do the peer review. And I certainly can't fault the folks in the department who were responsible for doing that, from trying to select peer reviewers who they thought would make the kind of decisions that they thought appropriate. I mean, that's frankly what I do when I select peer reviewers. But in this case, Congress had specified a particular makeup of a peer review panel, and that fell apart as the volume of applications required more peer reviewers. So, but I think the integrity of a review process is very important, and the department having some procedures to both create that integrity and the appearance of integrity would be a good thing, because you don't want, these aren't research grants, but nevertheless you don't want the process to be one that seems politicized or tainted when so much effort is going into to responding. So I don't know if that was responsive to all your questions. Yes?
Also, we talked a little bit about the utilization of research results, just a little bit more, specifically the challenges that you've had with what works clearinghouse.
Well, I think you're asking for me two questions. One is, what are the challenges with the What Works Clearinghouse and what's responsible for the delays, and the other is the utilization piece. I mean, they're connected in the sense that if you don't have anything out there, you can't expect people to use it. So, the delays aren't a good thing. So let me talk about at the technical level about delay issues with the What Works Clearinghouse and why. Probably 60% of the variance there are just administrative issues. Who the contractor is and who's on the task, and who's managing things in my office and that sort of thing. So some of the slippage is just due to management problems. But the interesting part of the slippage has to do with how an agency that's supposed to apply the highest standards and be a trusted source for identifying what works, which is what the WWC is designed to be, how such an entity deals with the messy nature of the current research literature in education. So probably a year was spent on dealing with the issue of misalignment between assignment of participants and analysis. And what I'm referring to is a situation in which 40 classrooms are randomly assigned to a treatment and control condition. And that's a very strong random assignment design. But you look at the published research, the research that's submitted by the developer, and you see that rather than analyzing with an N of 40, they analyze with an N of 40 times the number of kids in each classroom. And that produces an upward bias in terms of statistical significance. And 90% of the studies that What Works Clearinghouse looks at are misanalyzed in that way and or the failure to account for multiple tests. And so you'll have somebody with 20 outcomes, and they'll report a statistically significant difference on one of those outcomes at the .05 level. They've not accounted for the multiple comparisons at all. So dealing with misalignment, dealing with multiple outcomes, and how you appropriately characterize those took up a lot of time by the best people in the country who focus on these issues in education, including folks on the faculty here. The other part of it, and this is in part political, but I think political in a defensible way, is that we can't sustain an enterprise anchored by a dissemination mechanism, the What Works Clearinghouse, that achieves appropriately the nickname of the Nothing Works Clearinghouse. Right? You can't set a bar for research over which nothing can pass. You can't do that politically. You just can't. So we struggled with the issue of how can we get information in there that we believe is better than assistant superintendent for instruction putting 8 programs out there on a board, putting on a blindfold and walking around and pinning, putting a pin in one of them. Can we do something that will help them, that will increase the probability of making a good decision, even though the level of evidence is much weaker than you'd ideally want? And that took a long time, and frankly took my intervention at one point, where I got everybody together and said that we can't keep talking about this. We're going to have to make a decision. And how about this one? Will you all stay on board if we go this way? And so what we've ended up with is one of the solutions here. And it's a solution that deals with that is to address well-designed studies that are underpowered, which is another chronic problem in education. So it may be a decent intervention. And the differences between the intervention and control group may be healthy. But the thing is so underpowered, particularly when analyzed correctly, that it's not statistically significant. So even though the number I'm going to give you can change across subject areas and is determined by the principal investigators based on their knowledge of the field, we've set 0.25 effect size. And we report out substantively important results that achieve a 0.25 effect size, even if they're not statistically significant. So, long-winded, and for me it's very interesting stuff, but it's struggling with the weak literature and trying to determine how you can responsibly say something without really encouraging people to make bad decisions and without sending a signal to the field that weak research is all you need to do. And there is no perfect solution, and that has taken a long time. And the problems are solved now, or at least largely solved to my satisfaction. There's been a real burst of activity at the What Works Clearinghouse in the last 2 months, and we're expecting a total of about 70 reports to come out between the September just passed and perhaps March of this year. So there'll be enough there to remove the criticism that there's nothing, and I think to move the enterprise forward. And what we need to do is to have a commitment to the ability to move the bar. And, what we have identified now as sufficient evidence for us to characterize an intervention or a program as effective is a bar that we may raise in the future, and we try to be straightforward with developers about that. And in fact, we're in a struggle right now with a developer who, in a previous report, had their intervention described as having positive evidence associated with it, and it's going to be downgraded to potentially potentially positive, and so that's what we're going to do. Now, another part of the uptake problem is the mechanism, Whatworks clearinghouse mechanism, perfectly implemented, is only a portion of what's needed. And and some of the other pieces I think should be IES responsibilities to produce. So what you get from the Whatworks clearinghouse is like walking into a restaurant, and somebody's told you it's a good restaurant, so you don't have to worry that what you're going to find there is going to kill you. But you walk into a good restaurant, and what they give you is a list of their dishes. The list is not divided into salads and desserts and fishes. It's just a list. And you're told for $19.95 you can pick 4 items off the list. And so you may end up with 4 desserts. There's just no way for you to tell what it is. And to make the analogy more compelling, the menu's in a language you don't understand, right? So you're just picking selections from the list. Most problems that practitioners have to deal with are problems that are not addressed exclusively with a particular program. It may involve a choice of curriculum. It may involve a choice of professional development modules. It may involve a choice of assessments. It may involve a choice of time of the year to introduce something. It almost always involves management issues in terms of how you get people on board. And so it's a systemic issue, not addressed by a single selection. So we need to provide better guidance to the field on how you make a coherent set of selections when you're trying to address a problem that is multifaceted. We're going to try to address that. There's also a whole area, and I don't think this is an IS responsibility, though I'm still thinking about it, a whole area called procedural knowledge. So imagine you go to the Whatworks clearinghouse and you select a curriculum, and there's a lot of good evidence that it works. And there's another vehicle, we're going to call it a practice guide, that gives you some sense of where that curriculum sits in the context of other interventions you'd have to have in place for it to work. So you've got those things. You've made a selection, and the selection's presumably guided by good evidence. There's still a lot of craft knowledge as to how you make all that stuff work. And my thinking is that the department's comprehensive assistance centers ought to be the source of that craft knowledge. It could be training materials, it could be case studies, it could be videos, to give people a better sense of what you do with this stuff that you've selected. But all of that is part of uptake, part of utilization. And then finally, incentives and contingencies are part of it as well. People will come searching for answers when they're up against the wall and feel like they're not going to be able to get it done themselves. They're not going to be able to